you've done lots of investigative research on cults, right? Like,
well, the only other what I would call a cult that I spent time on was the Jonestown cult, Jim Jones, and that was the hardest story and the most wrenching story I ever did.
that was, how long ago was that?
Let's see.
That was in the Jonestown thing was in like was that the early 90s?
Yeah, but it was, excuse me, my story was apropos of the Branch Davidians.
Oh yeah.
And when the Branch Davidian, just before the apocalypse, my editor then was Tina Brown, and she asked me to go to Waco, and cover. And I said, Tina, there are more reporters than Branch Davidians in Waco now, and I just don't see joining the pack.
Right.
But I don't know if you would remember this, but there was a moment before the tanks started poking holes in the building and sending in tear gas and so on. David Koresh sent out a lot of the children, and there were, I don't know, just one or two vans with these kids who went, through the military line, the ATF, the FBI, the press, and then out of the property into a world they didn't know, and they were leaving behind everybody they knew. And their faces were so forlorn. I just remember, them passing the news cameras, and they just lost little kids. And I thought, well, that must have happened before. And so I started researching, and it turned out that there were survivors of the Jim Jones suicide massacre. Three of them. Well, there were more than that, but there were three who were the sons of Jim Jones.
Oh, yeah.
Two of them were adopted, and one, Stephen Jones, was his natural son. And they happened to have been in Georgetown, Guyana, playing basketball with the national team, and leaving their families in the jungle in Jonestown, in the Guianan jungles. And so I got in touch with Stephen, and they had never talked about it. It had been 15 years since the Jonestown debacle, and but this business in Waco brought it all back for them. So I went to, all three boys lived in the Bay Area. And I had these intense conversations with them. One of them, Tim, he was a big guy. He could curl 100 pounds in either arm. And he was, very obviously tough guy. But he hadn't, since Jonestown, he hadn't been able to get on an elevator. He had tried to get on a plane, but he made it turn around, which, it never happens unless Godzilla tells you.
Right.
But so he was wounded, and he agreed to talk, but he wanted to do it in a public place so he wouldn't cry. And he wanted to bring his wife along because he was only going to tell the story once, and he wanted her to hear it. So we went to this nice restaurant somewhere around the bay, and after like 10 minutes, he was sobbing and pounding the table, and the waiter made this huge, loop away from the table. Everybody in the restaurant was riveted and looking at their food, and he told a story of. He was the one who was chosen to fly back into Jonestown and identify the bodies of 900 people.
Oh my God.
His wife and children, his parents, his birth parents, his adopted parents, his friends, everybody he knew, his children. He had children he had to identify, and
God.
I was never more impressed with the power of belief that it would lead to such a colossal tragedy.
And were they supposed to be there?
Yeah, they were, and their attendance at the basketball game was very controversial in the Jonestown community. And they, these boys, they were young men when I talked to them. They bear a lot of guilt because they feel that had they been there, they might have been able to stop it. But I think that's not true. I mean, I don't think it was stoppable. For months, Jones had been training his followers, having these white nights, as they called it, where they would drink what they thought was cyanide and in a Kool-Aid. That's where the phrase comes from, drinking the Kool-Aid.
Right.
And then they'd be fine. So, but in this particular case, Congressman Leo Ryan had just flown down from San Francisco because some of his constituents were worried about relatives that were in Jonestown, and he was killed by some of Jones's followers.
Oh my
and
God.
So it was too late at that point. And Jones knew that trouble was coming his way, and he didn't want to die alone, so he wanted everybody to die with him. He was shot to death, and I guess he refused to take the cyanide. But
Yeah, who shot him?
it was I think it was this woman that was one of his mistresses.
Yeah, what do you think it is about the human mind that creates people like Jim Jones? Like what or not necessarily about the human mind, but maybe it's probably something about people's upbringing and their development. And like how does nature create a Jim Jones type character?
Well, the longing for power is a very human quality, and it manifests in different ways. He was a powerful speaker. He had a way of being, extremely compelling presence. Very dramatic looking man. He was part Cherokee and had very dark complexion and dark eyes, and handsome in a rugged way. He also was a conniver, and he would fake healings and things like that. I think all of this is with the idea of controlling other people. I think there's you see it in politics. I mean, it's not just religion. You see the longing to exercise control over other people is very powerful. And if you have the capacity that he had to be so compelling as he was, then his only goal was to increase his control. And that was why he moved his whole church out of San Francisco to the jungles of Guyana. And they did it overnight. People would wake up and they'd find their spouse gone, or, the parents had moved away. I mean, it was all secret and done, with amazing security. And they were flown to Guyana, a place that most of them couldn't even put on a map. And then, they lived out their final days in this jungle.
You also worked on a wild story about satanic ritual abuse.
Oh, yeah.
Which ties into all this crazy stuff.
I was in therapy back, this was like in the early 90s. And I loved my therapists. They were such dear, intelligent people.
Mm-hmm.
And because I was an investigative reporter, they said, well, we've been seeing a number of patients, basically young women, who in therapy are having these flashbacks, recovered memories of satanic abuse. and a lot of times they have multiple personality disorder. And then they said, and Satanists are responsible for more than 50 murders a year in Austin.
Satanists.
Yeah.
How do you define a Satanist? That would be my first question.
Well, my first question was, we don't have 50 murders in Austin a year.
Oh, wow.
Whether Satanist or not,
Right.
that's more than we've ever had. So, but I was intrigued, and then there was a conference of police who were the lecturer was about satanic ritual abuse, and this cop who was going around the country with his slideshow said that Satanists were responsible for 50,000 murders a year in the U.S. And once again, it was more than our actual total homicide count.
Right.
And these are cops. I thought, they should be a little more skeptical. But no. And so I went to my editor, Tina Brown, at the New Yorker, and I was proposed to do an article on multiple personality disorder. Mm. And she was, and I said, well, and sometimes in therapy they recover these memories of satanic abuse. Oh, that's so hot. That's so hot. She was so thrilled.
Yes, Larry, yes.
So I thought, well, how would I approach this? So the internet was young at that point, but it was very useful, and I could go through and find all these court cases of people who were suing their parents for abuse, or their therapists, or there were hundreds. And there was one case in which a person was convicted of satanic abuse, and he had confessed. And his name was Paul Ingram. He was a deputy sheriff in Olympia, Washington. And I thought, well, if there's anything to this, that'll be it. So I went to Olympia, and what I found was that Paul's had a family of 4, and 2 girls and 2 boys. And the girls, one of them, Erica, had made the initial outcry. And it got into the sheriff's department where Paul was a deputy. And so the assistant sheriff arrested him, and they brought in his preacher, an evangelical preacher, who told Paul that God will not let a false memory come into your brain. And then they brought in a psychiatrist who hypnotized him, and Paul had said, I know my girls wouldn't lie, but I don't remember it. So to help him remember, the psychiatrist and the preacher sat there with the deputy and elicited these memories of, satanic crimes. And in the church that they were a part of it, they called the Church of the Foursquare Gospel, there was a lot of gossip. You can imagine something like this was just, on everybody's mind. And and the preacher had access to the deputies and so on. So there was information coming out. And so that would generate new memories on the part of the daughters. And then it would be reported back to Paul, what they were saying, and he would come up with memories, but that they never had the same memory. There were all these disparate memories, and the girls were talking about these satanic fires. They'd have these campfires, and they would. The girls were impregnated and then later nailed to a table and had the fetus withdrawn from them, and that their neighbors had committed homicide, and it was bizarro stuff, but the cops took it seriously. They had helicopters flying around looking for, where the fires might have been. They were digging up the yard, and I asked the undersheriff, did you find any bones? There was, yes. Really, what was it? Well, it was an elk bone.
elk-
I mean, obviously offering this as evidence, right? And but the thing was that Paul confessed, and he felt like he must have done this. And when the questioning was so bizarre, because Paul, he had two friends that were also implicated by the girls. So when Ray or Jim, would come in, what did they do? Well, I think they must have raped my wife. Okay, and then what did you do? Well, I would have gone back to work, and it was this. It was all in this conditional tense. It must have been this way. I would have done this.
Yeah.
He never said I did it, but he confessed. So he went to prison. And at some point, I was in L.A., and I decided to go to the headquarters of the Church of the Foursquare Gospel. It was a church that Amy Semple McPherson created back in the old days of Hollywood. And so I was talking to the leader of the church, and I said, that first outcry by this girl, Erica, happened, I think, at your summer camp. Oh, yeah. One of our counselors led that. And I said, is she here? Yeah. Paula, come on in the office, So Paula, the evangelist who had been speaking at this church camp, came in, and I asked her about, the setting for this church camp and how many girls were there and what was her role and so on. And she said, I would be talking to them, and I would say, there's a girl in the room. I can see her in a closet. She's in a closet, and she's so afraid of her father, and she hears the footsteps coming towards the end. Some girl cried out, "It was me!" And a lot of hysteria, and so at the end of camp, she says, I was preparing to leave, and some of the counselors came over and said, "There's a young woman who needs your attention." And so Erica was actually a counselor in this at this camp, and we don't know what to do with her. She's on the stage and she's just weeping, and so Paula came over to Erica and she said, and I put my hand on her head, and I prayed over her, and I heard God say, "You've been abused." And then I said, and it's been happening for a long time, and it's your father. Now, this was a very religious young woman, Erica was, and she was getting this message from God telling her that her father had been abusing her. There was no evidence. There never was any evidence of it. It was only this transmittal, the hand on the head. Wow. And the message from God, and it led to the ruination of Paul Ingram's life and the splintering of his family, and it was. But he served years in prison, and once again, the business of trying to roll back a conviction is extremely difficult, especially one that had been framed as child abuse with a satanic addition to it.
Is that them?
Yeah, that's the family before it became the.
What did he say about, like, what did anyone ever ask him, like, why did you?
Oh yeah, I talked to him about it. He it's hard for him to understand because it seemed that he must have done something. He was very guilty, and he's a fervent believer. So he trusted his preacher and the psychiatrist, and these.
Wow.
I know you do a lot of interest and have a lot of interest in UFOs and stuff like that, but there was a study done in Georgia, which would not be allowed nowadays, but a psychiatrist or psychologist had a patient, and he told her, I'd like to do a little experiment. And I'm going to tell you, I'm going to hypnotize you, and I'm going to put some suggestions in your mind. And it's not going to be true. It's just, just see. And, so he hypnotized her. And he said, you were late to our session. What happened? Which wasn't true, And she said, well, I was driving along the road, and I saw a cow on the side of the road, who was trying to give birth. And she was really struggling. So I thought I could help. So I got out of the car, and I went over to help her. And he said, and then a light appeared. And she said, and then a light appeared overhead, and a spaceship came down. And, and she was abducted. And he woke her up, and he said, look, this is what you said. Bear in mind, you made it up. I planted it inadvertently in your mind, but just free yourself of this. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was as real to her as any other memory. And I think that's part of what was going on with Paul and to some extent with his children. They're fantasizing, they were charged with the idea that something happened. And that phrase has done a lot of damage, especially in child abuse cases and the old daycare pursuits. Remember the daycare hysteria? There was always, well, maybe they didn't, fly to Mexico and bury a giraffe, which was, for instance, in Austin, that was one of the daycare stories.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe that didn't happen, but something happened, or these kids wouldn't be so screwed up. So the jury would convict them on the something happened charge.
Yeah, what was that story about the daycare? The kid was telling their parents that they flew to Mexico and buried a giraffe or something? Where did that come
Fran
from?
and Dan's daycare. And, it was just a kind of neighborhood daycare. During that time, there were a lot of these daycare cases arising, and some of the parents were concerned. And so a mother asked, her daughter, had anything gone on in the daycare. And I think the daughter responded to one of the suggestions, well, maybe, or something like that. It was hard. So she called a psychologist, a local psychologist in Austin who I had interviewed, and she assembled some other family members, and they had back then they would have dolls that they used to illustrate, where did he touch you here and stuff like that. So these were parents and a psychologist interviewing very, very young children, and I went to about an hour of a trial of Fran and Dan. I think they might have been tried separately. I don't remember. But there's a little girl on the stand sitting in her big sister's lap. And the prosecutor, honey, did Dan hurt you? And she said, no. Did Dan touch you someplace you didn't? No. Your Honor, may we have a recess? And then it was yes.
After the recess.
Yeah, and it made me really scared to think that, and I was just a spectator. I wasn't on the jury. Right. And they might have heard other more compelling evidence, but they did hear evidence about how these kids were flown to Mexico and they were slaughtering wild animals and then flying back just in time to be picked up by mommy and daddy. I mean, that they served years in prison before they were exonerated.
Wow.
And it's a really dark mark on our culture that kind of hysteria is allowed to proliferate. Actually, I'm doing a story now that you would think is dark, and it is dark, but it's I'm looking at religion in a different way. There's the story that I wrote in the New Yorker in their 100th anniversary just a couple of months ago, that I'm making into a book now.
Oh, really?
I was walking with a friend, and she was talking about her mother, who's in the Catholic prison services, and spent time talking to women on the death row in Texas. There are 7 women on death row, and she talked about these nuns that came to visit them every month, and I thought,
oh, these are the young nuns.
There aren't very many young
right,
nuns.
They're mostly older.
The average age for a nun in America is 80.
Right.
But this is a new order called Sisters of Mary Morningstar that Pope Francis ordained. And they live in Waco, oddly enough, not so far from the remains of the Branch Davidian compound. But the sort of hero in my book is this Catholic deacon named Ronnie Lastovica, who's a cattleman, and he lives in Belton, Texas, and a real Texas figure. But he's a very pious Catholic, and his bishops said he wanted him to start ministering into the women's prisons. There are 5, I think, in Gatesville, and 4 of them are women's prisons and 1 men. Huntsville has most of the men. But so he started interviewing the women, or ministering to the women on death row, and it occurred to him that there were some women who lived very similar lives. So he drove over to Waco and knocked on the door of the convent. And bear in mind, these nuns, although they haven't taken a vow of silence, essentially they're silent and praying all day long. Mm-hmm. And wow. Although they're not cloistered, they don't go out very much. So Ronnie knocks on the door and says, "Sister, there's some women who could use your help. And they're living in community, but they don't know how. And you've got ancient monastic traditions about how to live together, and I think you could help them." And okay, well, where are they? Well, they're on death row. So, we don't get out much, So these women, their average age is mid-30s, and so if there's a future of Catholicism, I think they're going to be a part of it, but. They were terrified, but they felt obligated because Ronnie had asked, and it seemed like something that they were capable of. So they went to this highly secure prison, and interestingly, the guards were a little scared of the nuns. It's like they entered to a different order. So they were on their best behavior and a little awed. And they're all in these gray habits. They look,
What a riveting scene.
Yeah. And they walk into the, common room where the death row women are all dressed in white. And the weird thing is they immediately embraced each other. And it was true. They have very much in common. They each live in cells, as they're called in the convent. They each arise around 4:30 in the morning and pray, and then they got crafts and stuff. It's just very similar lives. But one of the nuns said, also, you should understand that we are not beautiful women. We don't use cosmetics. We don't dress in. There's nothing to be afraid of us, because we are plain. And the women on death row had long since gone past the days when they were vibrant young women. The years have taken a toll on them. So I think they really felt a kinship, and so I'm working on that story.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing about death row. I mean, there's a huge percentage. I don't remember the exact percentage. Maybe Steve, you can find it, but of people that end up on death row who are innocent, and it's like a big to do to get any sort of look over or like a redo of their conviction, or like a relook at like looking at their DNA, because I know they get the DNA wrong a lot, or like for whatever reason whoever gets these the prosecutors who get these convictions and the judges, and there's this reluctance to admit that they got something so serious like this wrong.
Well, there's one woman on death row who is actually innocent, and her name is Melissa Lucio, and she was convicted of murdering her 2-year-old toddler, who in fact had fallen down the steps, and that's what was the reason that she eventually died. She had like a brain hemorrhage.
Oh God!
But she was convicted by this prosecutor in Brownsville, Texas, who was running for Congress, and he was essentially working for the cartel, and he was selling sentences, and Melissa didn't have any money. So it would look good on his record if he had a death conviction for a child abuse case. And so he was hiding evidence, eyewitness testimony from her own children who saw the little girl fall down the steps. And that wasn't admitted in the trial. Her defense attorney had just applied for a job with the district attorney. And his wife was working for the judge, so it was a very comfortable scene in Brownsville.
Oh my God!
The prosecutor eventually went to prison himself. He was sentenced for 13 years for fraud, and served, I think, 5 of those years. But Melissa was finally demonstrated to be innocent because of all these factors. And once the fact that the eyewitness testimony was allowed in the court, it became very clear that she would never have been convicted. And yet, even now, she's on death row because the Court of Criminal Appeals is twiddling its thumbs, waiting to decide, should we free this one? Because of what you say, there's this sense that if the jury spoke and said she's guilty, then we have to move heaven and earth to actually change that. And
right.
There's another woman, Brittany Holberg, who was convicted of murdering this 80-year-old man in Amarillo. She was a prostitute at the time, but it was a gruesome 45-minute struggle between the two of them. And in a capital case, you have to. There are several things you can't. You don't get executed just because you murdered somebody. It has to have an additional factor. It has to be a child. It has to be in process of a robbery, or or process of escaping from prison. There are like 10 different things. Anyway, a jailhouse snitch. They put a woman in the cell with Brittany, and then she came out and said that Brittany told me she enjoyed killing him and that she was going to do it again and that she stole all this money. And so that eventually got to, the Court of Criminal Appeals in Texas and the Fifth Circuit in New Orleans. Mm-hmm. And her conviction has now been vacated, but it will be challenged by Texas, I'm sure, again. But in my opinion, when you use a jailhouse snitch who was paid for her testimony, I think that should, a retrial at best.
For sure. 100%.
The CIA was trying to blame the FBI for 9/11. And so I became part of their defense. And so practically anybody I wanted to talk to in the Bureau, I was able to talk to. And the CIA, I talked to people in the CIA, but they weren't nearly as forthcoming. And then a lot of my questions had to do with the fact that 2 of the hijackers came to America in January of 2000, like 19 months before 9/11, mm-hmm. and the CIA knew they were in America and didn't tell the FBI, and so they were trying to shove responsibility off of them, and put it onto the Bureau. And the Bureau was not perfect, but they didn't know that Al-Qaeda was in America until the CIA came and told them in late August of 2001, a month before the actual tragedy. So they didn't have the time to go out and find Al-Qaeda. The reason I'm convinced that the CIA ever came to tell the FBI is that they lost them. They didn't know where they were. And so now they maybe had been planning in cahoots with the Saudi intelligence to turn these guys. That's the theory of a lot of FBI guys. But they couldn't turn them if they had disappeared. And so
right.
They didn't see them again until they showed up on TV.
So the idea here with this internal rift between the CIA and the FBI is that John O'Neill and the FBI, Ali Soufan, they wanted to find the culprits and get rid of them or arrest them. And the intelligence community, the CIA, they wanted to keep their distance and try to figure out their way to get more intelligence.
Right.
Out
There was always a conflict in the mission of these two bureaus. And also, but that was compounded by personal animosity. And one of the leader of the Bin Laden unit in the CIA testified before Congress that one good thing happened on 9/11. John O'Neill was killed. That's the level of their hatred, and it got in the way. America could have withstood, an attack of some sort, but 9/11 was a trauma, deep wound in the country, and I still think that the CIA bears a lot of moral responsibility for that.
And so John O'Neill and mainly I think Ali Soufan, they pretty much snuffed the whole thing out, right?
Well, Ali was a unique individual.
Yeah.
He had
super young.
He was very young. He was the youngest case agent. He was in his 20s when he was case agent for 9/11, and he's the guy that identified the hijackers, and that he didn't torture anybody. He was very clever interrogator. He would, for instance, he had a little snippet of some taped conversation between two of these Al-Qaeda guys. And so that's all he had, in this one interrogation. And he got a shopping cart, with a bunch of similar shaped cassettes, on there, and to make it look like he had this, library. And he walked into this interrogation and he just picked randomly, supposedly, this one tape and popped it in and played this bit. And the suspect's eyes are like, oh my God, they overheard my telephone calls. And what else did they know? Wow. And so he just spilled the beans. There was no more beans. There was one bean, but it was clever interrogation, of a little trickery involved, but no torture. And he's the guy that pulled the FBI out of Guantanamo and said, we don't torture people. Wow. And he was going to arrest the CIA operatives that were doing the torture. He was prevented from doing that. But he's a man of the kind of principles that we'd like for the country to stand for.
Yeah. I'm sure you know John Kiriakou, right?
Yeah, not personally, but
right. Yeah, his story. I mean, he was the one who basically blew the whistle on the whole torture program, and look what happened to him. They sent him to prison and ruined his life.
Yeah,
stripped him of his retirement. So where did I want to go with this? Bin Laden. So I've had people on the show, including John, actually, who talk about how in the years leading up to 9/11, we had CIA people, paramilitary folks over in Khartoum in Africa and in the Middle East, basically tracking bin Laden's every move. And in fact, there's this guy by the name of Billy Waugh, who's like this famous CIA paramilitary commando, basically, who Annie Jacobson writes about in her book, Surprise, Kill, Vanish, who was there tracking the guy and going on daily jogs around the mosque that he would be visiting every day in Khartoum. He was taking photos of the guy. Of bin Laden. He would be like literally across the street from bin Laden, taking photos of him around the clock. And they couldn't get and then the way I understand it is, they couldn't get permission to take out bin Laden, even though they very easily could have. And as far as your understanding, why was that?
Well, at that time, there were a couple of things going on. Bin Laden was sort of laying low, and he spent, I think, 4 years in Sudan. Mm-hmm. He wasn't active. He was mainly, Al-Qaeda had become a kind of agricultural institution. He was developing all these seeds that he was very proud of, and he was, he may have owned more land in Sudan than any other individual. And they played soccer and stuff like that. So it wasn't, he was anti-American, he was making noise. But at this point, the king was trying to reconcile with him. And he sent Jamal Khashoggi. You may
Jamal
remember.
Khashoggi, yeah.
It was bin Laden's buddy. And although, not a follower, he was a friend of his and had spent time in Afghanistan mm-hmm. with bin Laden during the Mujahideen days. Mm-hmm. And Jamal was a reporter, and he was a friend of mine. And
really?
He was sent to Khartoum explicitly to get bin Laden to renounce terrorism. And then you'll be welcome home.
Who sent him there?
The king.
Oh.
And so the way Jamal explained it to me, he'd spent 3 days in Khartoum, and bin Laden was always very close to the point of renouncing terrorism because he was homesick. But finally, he wouldn't cross that line. So Jamal went home empty-handed, and at that point, the Sudanese decided to expel him and rob him of practically everything that he had, all of his possessions. And I went to Sudan 3 times tracking that story down. And
wow.
The first time I went, I had been working closely with the Sudanese intelligence, and because someone had referred me. And so they would drive me around and show me where bin Laden lived and the mosque and where the soccer fields were and all this sort of stuff. But I said, look, I need to talk to somebody in Al-Qaeda. And so one day I was in in my room in what they called cheerfully the Hilton. And I'd have to flash back a little bit. The first time I flew to Saudi Arabia, mm-hmm. I had a job there. I'm mentoring these young reporters at this Saudi Gazette. When I got off the plane, I was in terrible pain. My back was really killing me. And for the 3 months I was there the first time, I couldn't raise my toes. I was just, it was a lot of terrible sciatic pain. Mm. So the next time I went back to Saudi Arabia, I took one of those exercise balls that you sit on when your back is pain. And back then you didn't have the pump, so you had to blow it up, and then unblow it. And so I flew to Khartoum with my exercise ball, and so there was a knock at the door, and the Sudanese intelligence officer was there, and he had this guy with him, and he wouldn't tell me who he was. So come on in, and I offered the guy, the mysterious guy, the desk chair, and the intelligence agent lay down on my bed and went soundly asleep. So it left me with this guy that I quickly discerned was an Al-Qaeda member, and so I sat down on the ball, and he was over there, and I started asking him questions, and he knew everything. And I thought, Jesus, who is this guy? And so I flew back to America, and I researched him, and I triangulated, and I came up with Mohammed Loy Boyazid. His Qaeda name was Abu Rida al-Suri. And he was the guy who took the notes when Al-Qaeda was founded. It's in his handwriting. And I suddenly, holy shit. I was talking to the guy that has been in Al-Qaeda from the moment it started, and I didn't know that. So I flew back to Khartoum, and he wouldn't see me. And that was disappointing. And so finally he agreed if I came again, he would talk to me. And so I flew back. I said, Loé, it's a lot of trouble coming to Khartoum. Why didn't you see me last time? He said, well, I didn't know how seriously to take you. When we met the first time, you were sitting on a balloon. So that's how I got into Al-Qaeda.
Wow.
It was, when bin Laden left Sudan, there's a case to be made. We should have just left him alone. But
because we helped bin Laden originally, right? We helped him against the Soviet Union.
Yes, in that sense, we didn't directly give money to him, but we were fighting the same cause, and so in that sense we were allies. But there was a myth that that we were underwriting him. That never was true. Nor would he even want it.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, he got plenty of money from Saudi Arabia. He didn't need ours.
Yeah. Before 9/11 is when the United States intelligence community goes to the FBI and says, we know these people are in the U.S., but we lost track of them.
Yeah, that's in August.
That's in August.
2001.
Right. And did they, how long before that did they know that they were, like, for example, taking these like flying lessons over here in Florida, like down the street from where we are now, and being handled by these Saudi intelligence people?
It was episodic with the information. It wasn't pulled together. There was suspicion. Like in Arizona, there was an industrious guy who found out about these Saudis who were in a flight school, but they didn't feel like they needed to learn how to land.
Right.
And it was a similar story with a guy named Masawi, who was very flagrant in his and aggressive about getting to fly. He wanted to fly Boeing planes. He was very, and it was suspicious enough that the local FBI chief reported it. So, but was there ever the moment where somebody said, I'm getting a lot of reports of these guys who are Saudis who are trying to learn how to fly and not land?
Yeah.
That never happened.
No. There was also safe houses, I think, on the West Coast in California where some of these guys were staying, and there was Saudi official or Saudi intelligence people that were somehow connected to this.
These two hijackers that I told you about earlier, who they arrived in, they flew in from Malaysia. There'd been a big meeting of Qaeda operatives and from that meeting, they came to America. And also from that meeting, there were some guys who would then go blow up the USS Cole. So it was a high-level meeting of terrorists in Kuala Lumpur. And two of these guys, Midhar and Al-Hazmi, flew into LAX on January the 5th, I think. And then on January 15th, the CIA found out about them. So early on, and they were told by Saudi intelligence. I interviewed Prince Turki Al Faisal, who said that he told the chief of station in Riyadh about these two Al Qaeda guys. So the CIA found out about it, not through their own detection, but then.
Was CIA working with Saudi intelligence?
Well, that's what I believe. Okay. I think that, they were closely tied, but, and Turkey, went to school for a while with Bill Clinton. I've forgotten exactly what anyway, he was very close. Saudi intelligence and U.S. intelligence worked together closely,
Okay.
but not as closely as they should have. And when the CIA found out about this, by that time, these two hijackers, shortly after they arrived, they were greeted in a restaurant by a fellow Saudi who had just come from the Saudi embassy or consulate in L.A. And lo and behold, surprise, you're from my country. And he sits down and tells him, well, you must move to San Diego. I will help set you up. And he does do that. And they move down to San Diego. Mm-hmm. And it's at that point that the CIA is beginning to take an interest in them. We don't know. They won't. To date, they haven't really divulged, what they did. And this, I don't want this to die. I want to see this information come out. I mean,
is this part of the report that was never shown? The part of the 9/11 Commission that was hidden?
There's still stuff that's redacted about it, yeah. And the 22 pages or whatever it was that the victims' families finally forced out of the CIA. It didn't cover all the material, but it did expose some very interesting stuff, like the tests. The Saudis would be on airplanes, and they would, in one case, for instance, walk up and open the cockpit door. Oh, I'm sorry, I thought it was a bathroom, and they got so suspicious that the plane was grounded, and they were interrogated, and they said, oh no, we're Saudis, we're very prominent. Prince Bandar, who was the head of the ambassador to the U.S., is a friend of ours. As a matter of fact, Bandar's wife was sending money to the people to the hijackers. So,
really,
let me try to get this straight. She was sending money. I'm afraid to get too deep into the well there, because I'm not exactly. Money from her was given to the operative who was working with the hijackers, or to them, the hijackers themselves. But I forget exactly how that worked. But on these test runs, they were clearly planning the operation as it was going to go down.
Yeah.
And where would we sit on the airplane, and sort of how hard is it to get into the cockpit? Well, not hard, as it turned out.
Right.
And all of that came out in those pages that had been suppressed for no reason except to protect the dignity of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. My thinking about this is that I don't think that the Saudi king wanted to attack America. And I think that, when Prince Turki divulged the presence of two Saudis to the CIA, he was doing us a great favor. And I'm sure that he thought that, America would take care of this problem. Mm-hmm. I also think that the CIA decided, let's let the Saudis handle this. They can follow them, and then they have their means. They can turn them, and maybe that's out of our capacity. So for that reason, they were just going to lightly monitor the situation and expect that the Saudis would take care of the problem.